Good morning and welcome to Westminster Presbyterian Church Adult Learning Hour. I am Alanna Simone Tyler and I'm here with Matt Skinner, and we are delighted to introduce Diane Moffett. As we continue in our year of listening at Westminster, we again welcome Reverend Dr. Diane Moffett to join us for the Adult Education Hour, and we welcome her also as our guest preacher today. For nearly 3 years, Diane has served as the president and executive director of the Presbyterian Mission Agency. That is the mission and ministry arm of our denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA. Diane and the PMA staff have been energetically seeking to equip PCUSA congregations just like Westminster to take our living faith into the world. Prior to her current role, Diane served as senior pastor of St. James Presbyterian Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. While there, she was actively involved in her community, serving on several boards, becoming a candidate for mayor, and she was the co-chair of Greensboro's Interfaith Clergy Council. Diane, we welcome you, and we are glad you are with us again.
Thank you, Alanna. It is a pleasure for me to be with you. I'm actually chewing the rest of my breakfast that I so let me do that. I also want to say that it's a pleasure. I was able to chat with Matt Skinner and was sharing with him how I appreciate the work of Text Week and the Working Preacher. So I've known you by name, so it's nice to put a face and to be with you all today. So I bring you greetings from, it's your mission agency. We are in service to you. We exist to serve congregations and mid-councils, both domestically and partners around the world in 70 countries. I work with approximately 350 persons to do this work, to make sure that the good news of Jesus Christ is being proclaimed to the poor and the captives and those who need new sight. And I often say to people, and they get to determine whether it's good news. So we want to make sure that we are embodying the teachings and principles of Jesus. And again, it is just an absolute pleasure for me to be with all of you today. So thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your work, your spiritual work, the work that you're doing in your community. Westminster is a very important church, as all of our congregations are, as we seek to be the expression of Christ in the 21st century in a time where there's so much unrest and so much going on. We need to really lean in and discern what the Spirit is saying to the church. So thank you for your openness and for your ministry. I want to give a shout out to Pastor Tim Hart Anderson. I went to seminary with him. And so I don't know if he's on the call, but just in absentia, how about that? So thanks for your ministry too, Tim. So the Presbyterian Mission Agency is one of 6 agencies in the church. We are the largest in terms of staff, which makes a lot of sense because the church's whole purpose is to continue the ministry and to bear witness to the risen Christ, the one whom we follow. The purpose of the mission agency, if you'll go to the next screen, is simply to inspire, equip, and connect all Presbyterians in mission and ministry. So there are about 1.24 million of us, and that's a big task. We are in different contexts. We are around the nation and around the globe. I know that you all work with South Sudan, for example, and Shelvis Mathis, Shelvis and his wife, mission coworkers in South Sudan. So we've got a lot going on. And so we want to be able to have an expression that connects us and that helps us all to understand that we are many parts of one body that is seeking to express and to represent Jesus, the Christ, the anointed one, in a world that is in such need of the healing power of the Spirit and in such need of the reconciliation of humanity to God, to one another, and to our planet, quite frankly. So Matthew 25, if you go to the next slide, is the vision that the Presbyterian Mission Agency has lifted up. We did not create it. It was created by the General Assembly. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But when I came to this role in June of 2018, I was given a mission work plan. And at any time, having experience in the pastorate for 33 years, anytime you want to help to lead a people and to discern where God is at work and join God there, you've got to have a vision. And it's got to be an articulate vision. It's got to be something that people know, they can say it. It's got to be lofty enough to stretch us. But it also has to be doable. And so I immediately went to the staff and we wanted to have a vision. And I learned that the General Assembly back in the 222nd General Assembly with Denise Anderson and Jan Edmonds, where they were co-moderators, that this had Matthew 25 had come to surface. And it had largely come to surface because there were some people in the General Assembly who wanted the church to do away with anything that had to do with social justice, anything that was might be termed quote unquote by some political. We just kind of wanted us to be kind of just close our eyes. And I'm certainly paraphrasing. These are my words, not the words of the assembly. But just kind of let's not even focus on anything like that. Let's just kind of get our relationship with Jesus together. But the relationship with Jesus has everything to do with God and with one another. It is both vertical and horizontal. And so people begin to say, no, 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 no. And that's how Matthew 25 emerged out of that General Assembly. The problem is I was in Greensboro, North Carolina. I had no idea that the assembly had passed this. Perhaps you didn't either. But as I come to this role, what is important to me is that congregations and co-workers around the world do the heavy lifting. So anything that the General Assembly comes to and decides, it's got to be pragmatic and it needs to be known. We've got to be able to express it. And so we've been seeking to embed this vision, to lift it up and to invite people to wrap their arms around it. We believe that this vision fits us and that it makes sense and that it also can stretch us. So if you go to the next slide, Matthew 25 has become the biblically based, theologically grounded, ecclesiastically affirmed, practically implemented, contextually adoptable, and effectively life-giving vision for the Presbyterian Church USA and its mission. So that's what Matthew 25 is all about. And again, if you go to the next slide, it is the biblical, theological, ecclesial basis for the mission work plan. So when we talk about a mission work plan, let me explain to you, that's kind of like the strategic plan of the Presbyterian Mission Agency, which is adopted by the General Assembly. And the General Assembly basically says, Presbyterian Mission Agency, we want you to help us do this work. So when I was elected as the president and executive director of the mission agency, the mission work plan had already been adopted. So they said to me, we want you to inspire, equip, and connect all Presbyterians in ministry and mission. And we want you to do this work, which is, if you go to slide 6, the work of building congregational vitality, eradicating systemic poverty, and dismantling structural racism. That's what we want you to do. And then I was put on notice that every 2 years, this mission work plan gets revisited and can change. So as a pastor, I said, first of all, this can be something that we do until thy kingdom come. This is the basic work of the church. Second of all, as a pastor in a local congregation, if you're going to be switching your work plan every 2 years, I'm not going to necessarily acquiesce, because I understand that it takes time for a people to embody, to think about, and to put these kinds of statements into action. And so I was grateful that, having adopted this mission work plan in the 223rd General Assembly, that the 224th General Assembly said, we're going to stay the course with this mission work plan to build congregational vitality, eradicate systemic poverty, dismantle social racism. And I hope that we will continue to do this, because in my understanding, this is the basic work of the church and has many ways in which we can begin to put flesh on it. So let me talk to you a little bit about these three foci, or some people say focuses, and what I believe that we're trying to do amidst COVID-19, amidst racial unrest, amidst the rising violence against not only Black and the Black community, but the Asian American Pacific Islanders, the polarity of the political parties, the understanding of what is truth, all of that stuff. There's so much going on. So what is the church doing with these three foci? So if you go to congregational vitality is basically the embodiment of Christian principles and practices that lead believers in congregations to actively engage our world, following Jesus and doing the work necessary to build God's kingdom. That's slide 7, if you'll go to the next slide. Congregational vitality involves making disciples. It involves faith formation. It involves, understanding what it means to follow Jesus. He said, if you will come after me, you got to take up the cross and follow me. We don't really like to talk about the cross or the suffering or the work that is not comfortable, that will put us in places where we may not want to go. But nonetheless, if we're following Jesus, he didn't get a pass. He was executed by the Roman Empire for sedition. Now, he didn't come out and say, I'm going to be a political leader, but he had principles that so conflicted with what the dominant empire, the culture at that time, believed, that he was a threat. And so they killed him. We don't get a pass on taking up the cross. So this uncomfortability, this not all of that, that's a part of what it means to follow Jesus. And we, I believe, cannot do it without an encounter with God through the Holy Spirit. Pentecost is today, right? We need the power of the Holy Spirit. So that's why even when the disciples, when Jesus appeared to them and his resurrection accounts, they were all excited because they could see that he was alive and they wanted to go out. And he said, no, remain in Jerusalem until I send you a gift. You're going to need this empowerment because I know the journey ahead of you. They're going to get you just like they got me. But guess what? Look on this other side. Look at the hope. Can't you see the glimpse of glory when we are properly related to God and to one another and to the planet that we live in? Can't you see this? And so it's for the hope that is before us that we began to embody and to continue this mission of Jesus. So you often hear me say we are representing him. And to the degree that we do this, we are being faithful disciples. We are helping to build the kingdom, or some people say kingdom, acknowledging the different people that are part of the kingdom. For me, I like the definition. I can't think of it. He wrote Understanding the Mind of Christ, but he talks about the kingdom as not just a place you go to, but a place you come from. And so Jesus's kingdom principles often run counterintuitive to what we experience in the culture. Jesus says, if you want to be rich, sell everything you have and give to the poor. And you will have treasure in heaven, and follow me. If you want to be great, be a servant of all. If you want to find your life, let go, lose it in service to me. And I'm telling you, you're going to find life. You're going to find meaning for your time on the planet. So these things run counterintuitive to what the world says. Get everything you can everything you get, sit on your can and make sure nobody else can get to it. So all of this is different. And so when we are being kingdom people and kingdom minded, we're going to run up against the dominant culture, the empire, or the rulers of the day, and we got to be ready for it. We've got to have that vitality and that energy that comes, that goes certainly beyond us. We need the power of the Holy Spirit and the teachings of Jesus and his life. He knows what it means to live under domination. And so the story, even in Matthew 25, is not something that he pulled out of the sky. He himself knows the story of his parents, I'm sure, who had to leave as refugees, running for their life because Herod was killing the baby boys. He needed welcome. Perhaps they were hungry. He understands all of this. That is where his social context is, and we should never forget his story. So when we talk and hear about his kingdom principles, he is giving them out of his lived experience on this side of heaven. Congregational vitality. You go to the next one, systemic poverty. We're dealing with systems, especially in Matthew 25. Jesus is judging nations. Nations create systems that have an outcome. So I often say, if one fish rolls up on the shore, you say, what's wrong with that fish? And you start poking at the fish and examining the fish has a problem. But if you have a school of fish that wash up on the shore, you say, what's wrong with the water? In other words, the water is producing an outcome that is causing all of this wreckage. And that's what we talk about when we talk about systemic poverty. Yes, people have choices. We understand that, but choices are limited when you come into a situation where you do not have access to the material and social capital to ensure your basic well-being. And so that's a definition of systemic poverty. It's also the exploitation of people, right? Systemic poverty is created by humans. We create systems that create these kinds of outcomes. And then we say people are disposable. Why? Because the myth that we're looking is that, oh, they must be lazy. Something's wrong with them. They can't fit into the system. But oftentimes we are the ones that are creating the kind of bias, the kind of bigotry, the kind of hoarding that limits their choice and their access to the system. So systemic poverty is not just being compassionate, which is important, feeding those who are hungry. But the bigger question is, what system is in place that is producing this kind of hunger? And let's make sure that we deal with the policies and the principles and the laws that are creating this. Let's create a more just and equitable laws so that people can thrive and come into the fullness of life that Jesus talks about in the Gospel of John, the 10th chapter and the 10th verse. So that's what systemic poverty is. It's not based so much on the individual as looking at a critique of the system and saying we've got to redo the system so that all people may flourish, because people are not disposable. They're precious. Structural racism has little to do with what you're thinking and how you feel about people of color or indigenous people. It has to do with the institutional, the structural pieces that have been put in place, particularly from the founding of this nation, that basically normalizes and legitimizes an array of dynamics. These dynamics are historical, they're cultural, they're institutional, they're interpersonal, and they routinely advantage people with white skin while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. And Marian Vassar, that's her, she is the officer for diversity, equity, inclusion at the University of Louisville. And that's one of her definitions when we talk about structure. We're looking about the structures that produce certain outcomes. We're going to be looking at George Floyd's anniversary of his death. This kind of public lynching has happened on so many occasions. It happens kind of normal. People who are people of color understand this narrative, but the dominant culture wants to wipe it out and say, oh, that's not, oh, they were just, well, if only they would have acted better, if they would have obeyed the officer. We have so many instances when all that happens and people still get shot, because the understanding and the myth and the narrative is that somehow people that are indigenous people, Black people, of color are somehow, their difference makes us deficient, and therefore our bodies need to be policed. And this kind of policing is very much connected to the kind of slave, the people that would look over the slave overseers. And so when we look at police, we know that they're to protect white folk by and large, and then against us. So there's a whole different narrative going on in the communities about the police. And that's not to say that every police officer is corrupt, but you in some positions, you cannot have corruption. In other words, you can't have a few good pilots or a few bad pilots that are running airplanes. Oh yeah, most of our pilots are good. We just have a few bad ones. The few bad ones can cause such collision that the airplane can crash. Well, it's the same kind of thing here. And we understand this system that is really going on now. The mass incarceration of Black people, for example, and just the mass incarceration in an industrialized nation. We have more people in jail than any other industrialized nation. That's not by chance, that's a system. That's systems. And read Michelle, read all the books. I mean, I don't have to do that for you. There's so many things that information out there, and we have them on our website that can help you get to this if you really want that information. So structural racism is a social construct, and it's basically designed to concentrate capital, both material and social, within one group or race of people over others. And so even though the country was built on the backs of indigenous people, Black enslaved people, and America became great off of the labor of people who did not get paid for their labor. That's why you have this enormous wealth gap. And then you have institutions in place to make sure that people of color are only going to get so much of it. It's really blood money. And so we have to acknowledge that. We're not talking about making people feel guilty. We're talking about an accurate story and then correcting the narrative so that there can be some equity. That's what structural racism is all about. And we know that it is key to the gospel because the gospel is concerned about relationships, loving God and loving one another. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. You can't decide that that's not important. It's central. God is concerned about relationships, and that's what Matthew 25 says. Now, every structure, every system is built on a narrative or a story. And so if you go to the next slide, the structure of racism is built on the story of white supremacy, that white people are better. We're better. And because we're better, everybody else is beneath us. Therefore, we get the right to dominate, control, call the rules. And in the case of coming over with indigenous people, we can take their land, save the Indian, but kill all the culture. We can rape them, we can mutilate them, and then we can say our story. Oh, we discovered America. Well, truth crushed to the ground will rise again. No lie will live forever. People now understand that narrative is not our narrative. It's based on a supremacy model that says that we can dominate other people based upon our skin color. Also, with that is a privilege. There's bias. We all have it. We have to recognize it. There's a privilege that white people with white skin and white features, they have certainly greater access to power and structure and resources than people of color in the same situation. So this is what creates this. So it's based upon this narrative. And so this is what the church is saying. This is really destroying. It's really poison. It's a mental health issue. Because when you're thinking that you're better than everybody else, you can then kill people, you can create genocide, you can create all kinds of laws that will eventually, again, destroy the society in which you live. So, Westminster, all these three foci are all interconnected. Congregational vitality. First of all, it's our job to make disciples who understand and who are embracing the gospel, the good news of the gospel, who understand the preferential treatment that Jesus has for the poor and people who are oppressed, people who are othered, that has to do with women, that has to do with people from the LGBTQIA community, anybody who is othered, people who are physically differently abled. When we other people and make them disposable, that's a problem. So Christians have to understand how God has created us in all of our diversity. And when God created our humanity, we're fearfully and wonderfully made, Psalm 139 says, but God called us good. We are good. We are enough in our particular cultural context. And so, we have to begin to understand how it is that we live out the Christian faith, modeling our life after Jesus. And when we do that, we will see, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." He claimed the words of Isaiah in Luke 4, because God has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. So I often say to people, will the poor, though people who are dealing with poverty amongst in your community, will they say that you are preaching good news? And it's not so much what you say, but what we see in Matthew 25's gospel, throughout the gospel, it's what you do, because you actually do what you believe. So if there's a transformation in your heart, you're going to respond to people and systems that are oppressive in a certain kind of way. So all of this is connected. People who are poor, people who tend to be impressed to the margins, people who are experiencing racism, the same thing. You'll find more people of color at the margins in the world, not only in California, not only in Minneapolis and New Jersey, but in the world. You'll see how racism has infected and how it is beginning to be an issue. And the generations after us now are calling it out. So we have a great opportunity. So there's this intersection between these three foci. So let me go back, and then I wanted to stop and I want to get your questions. I wanted to just kind of talk about Matthew 25 is biblically based. Let's understand that it's based upon the gospel, that particularly Matthew 25 verses 31 to 46, but the entire chapter gives this emerging understanding of the expectations of Jesus as of people who are truly authentic followers. And so I quote Matthew 7:25 here because the teachings of Jesus, we get into, what do you believe? What do you believe? Jesus is more concerned about what you do, because what you do is a reflection of what you believe. We are first being, and it is out of our being that we do, not the opposite around. And sometimes we want to think that because that's how our culture operates. If I want to be a doctor, I first go and do all this, do that, take this course, go through this, pass this, then you go to residency, then you're a doctor. But when you think of our humanity, it's first based upon who you are. The other thing is that in terms of theologically grounded, the standard of judgment is all nations. Jesus is judging all nations, rich nations, poor nations, nations that are capital, nations that are socialist, coming, all nations. He's judging all nations in terms of how you treat the least of these. And the least of these are not always, if you go to slide 14, the other people. If we are doing this work, and as Jesus experienced doing this work, we also become the least of these. We get thrown in jail. We suffer hunger and thirst, and we're in need of welcome. That's a part of his story. And so we need not think of the least of these as those poor old people over there. No, if you're doing the work, not only do you stand with and are part of the least of these, but you are a part of the narrative that Jesus is unfolding. And so an encounter with the least of these is encounter with the divine. God is in the midst of them. I told you we're ecclesiastically affirmed. Many of you are aware of the great ends of the church. And so when people say, oh, we're being political, have you read the great ends of the church? This is what we believe, and that is in our book of order, but it's also based upon the scripture. And so I always want to go there and talk about the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of humankind, which is congregational vitality, nurturing and fellowshipping and making disciples. All of this is in service to a greater thing, that we would be doing the promotion of social righteousness and we would exhibit the kingdom of heaven. So I just kind of play with that for people who are asking those questions and raising those questions about the church. And then again, I'm not going to go into detail because I want to get you all to interact with me. But again, the General Assembly had a rationale back in 2016 that we would choose to be a church committed to the gospel of Matthew 25, and of course to the entire scripture. But Matthew 25 really makes it plain. You don't need a seminary degree. It says there, I'm judging nations, I'm judging systems that produce certain outcomes. And so I expect you to be compassionate, and I expect you to be part of, or try to be a part of creating, as you work towards the kingdom, systems that reflect my principles and my understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to be created in the Imago Dei. So that's what the slide 16 and 17 are all about. And then I'm gonna, so what we're doing is in line with the church, what the church has said. You can see that from recommendation number 7. And so I'm not going to go into detail all of that. I just want to go to say that there are people that are have gotten into this. They're doing their thing. If you go to PCUSA.org/Matthew 25, there are all kinds of videos, all kinds of curriculum. Other churches are involved. I want to know what you're doing to embody this, because I applaud and I'm grateful that you are part of this vision to connect us, that we do ministry together, larger, smaller, here around the world. But St. Mark's is doing a fabulous job. They have begun to eradicate poverty, first of all, by getting close to their community and standing with and knowing the faces and the people that are dealing with poverty. So my whole thing is you start there, and then because it is personal to you and you understand it, then you begin to go into the city hall, into government halls. Knox Presbyterian Church is another story that I wanted to lift up to you. It's in the chat, I believe. And they discovered that they had an endowment that was explicitly racist and said this money is only to be used for the people of the white race. And they began to look into their history and discover that. And so now they are dealing with dismantling structural racism, and they're also dealing with reparations. How do we begin to talk about curing what we have seen happen? It's a very fascinating video and a fascinating story. Just to let you know, you're a part of 830 individual congregations, about 4,850 people in groups. That's colleges, university, caucuses. We had another synod join, so we have actually 10 of the 16 synods that are Matthew 25, and 40% of our presbyteries have said, this is what we want to be about. This vision fits us. We're going to work to make sure that our congregations and our people see their ministry through this lens and then begin to develop their ministry. I'm only going to say that, for more information about resources and things, you can go to the website there. I want to stop now. I think I've done enough. I would love to hear from you all and what you're thinking. So I'm going to stop now.
Thanks, Diane. Alanna and I have been following along, just invisibly here. So can I start with a question that takes us into this work through Matthew 25 in your point of view? So like, as you know, we've got sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion in the Presbyterian Church, and we believe that somehow we encounter God in those sacraments, in those moments. But Matthew 25 also says you encounter God, you encounter the person of Jesus when you engage in this kind of mission, this kind of service, this kind of, dignifying the other. Can you talk a bit about that? Is that a motive? Like we get something out of this. We get an encounter with the divine when we are attuned to this vision of justice, don't we?
Yeah. So absolutely. To me, the places and spaces where people have really grown, where there has been transformation of the understanding of the difference our life can make, the meaning in our life, is to embrace the other and that we have termed other, right? That the very thing that we don't want to do is often the thing that we need to do in order to stretch us and to help us understand and to see God at work, because God is already at work in the lives of the people. But it's a matter of you've erased their story, or we may have considered them disposable. So when you start encountering that, oh my God, the level of empathy, the level of listening is no longer kind of, I'm listening for information. Okay, tell me about it, or how am I different from that? But it goes to an empathetic kind of level of encounter that is transformative. So if you want to be transformed, if you want to encounter God, then Jesus is saying, I'm there with those folks who are on the others, because I'm there. I was marginalized. I understand this story. The story is like, again, it's not some kind of abstract thing, but I'm kind of, paying intellectual assent to. I have lived this story. I understand what it means. And so when you encounter them, you encounter my story. My story is there. So understand that. And that is the point of transformation. So that it's no longer, I got some information, or I'm trying to do, but I then can grow in my encounter and be opened up in my own understanding of who God is and how God is showing up. And it is absolutely life-giving.
Thanks for that. I have a second question too, which Matthew 25 like takes place at the end of time, right? Or the judgment of the nations. It's got this future view, but I can't wait that long. So like, how do we know that we're making progress? Like, how do you know in your position? That's one thing, but how does a congregation like Westminster know that it's making progress? Not saying we're done. We're never done. Like you said, this is a kingdom come kind of timeline that we're on, but how do we know that we're taking steps, especially when the problems are so massive and they feel insurmountable so many times?
So I think we're people of story. So our stories begin to change. That's how you know. In other words, our stories are impacted. And I think the church will begin to, if we listen to the stories that we have, they become, I guess, the narrative shifts. So you have to listen for the stories to know that change is taking place. When I talk about people encountering the other, not only out of my own experience as a pastor, but out of the experiences that I've also listened to from others, because we're learning and listening together, right? The stories change. For example, in that St. Mark's video that I said, y'all, you might want to watch, I remember one person saying, I used to just walk by, or just pass by or drive by the encampment where people had their tents on. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to go. I mean, I was scared. Those people over there, somehow, I didn't want to. But when I came and I sat down and began to talk to them out of an understanding that poverty is an issue for Jesus, and those systems that set people up and cause people to be disposable or sleeping on the sidewalk, whatever, then my whole understanding changed. But not only that, one of the sweetest things that I have ever experienced was back actually when I was at Harbor House Ministry, executive director for Harbor House, where we had BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color, full of Latinx, Asian Pacific Islanders, Hmong, Laotian, just all kinds of people. It was really, we dealt with people who were dealing with poverty, who were dealing with economic. And I just remember we started some businesses based upon the gifts that were there so that people could have but it feels to me so much more powerful to not only say, I'm going to do the poor, or I'm concerned about poor, but actually do stuff that actually goes, and you begin to align. And it is our gift. The motivation is our gift. We're the ones who need to be changed, right? It's not all the people. I'm not suggesting that they're perfect, or I'm not trying to romanticize poverty and racism. But what I'm saying is the people who are responsible for that are not the people who are victims of it. And so when you begin to do that kind of work, you also discover both your interconnection, your internal spirituality, but also the power of the church to actually change, Romans 12, right? Be not conformed to this world, but transform it by the renewing of your mind. And I will do this spiritual work in you, right? Expand, open up, repent, come into a larger awareness. It's not just turning from something, but saying this little part that I saw, that was just a little part. I want to turn towards a greater awareness of what God is doing in us. And so I think that that's how you know. So I always say to people, because people have asked that question, well, how do you know? How will we know if we're doing the work? Tell me about your stories. Tell me about how you've decided to set that this is the lens. Now pay attention to what the Spirit is doing in you. Pay attention to your stories. You will know if transformation is happening within you and within the people that you serve. And don't you make the decision. Ask them, was this good news that we set this up for you? They'll tell you. And they're the ones who hold that power and that authority.
I love, Diane, that you are inviting us to a kind of mindfulness and to both noticing ourselves, noticing our neighbors, and telling our stories. And are they different stories than we used to tell? And so Matt and I, don't want this opportunity to pass without us knowing a little bit more of your story. It is our sense that before you came to the Presbyterian Mission Agency and you just did a little bit of sharing about your experience at Harbor Light, that you were doing Matthew 25. And so how is it that you've centered this and doing it? What can you tell us? What would you want us to know about how this has been alive in you?
So thank you for that question. I started looking back. I was ordained in 87 at a little church that was supposed to close. I was in seminary and they said, we just want you to come preach. That church is still open. One of the few that are open in East Oakland. So that's number one. But it was back in, the Rodney King, when I got there, the Rodney King, shortly after that, the riots kind of broke out. There was, a lot of conflict between African-American and Koreans at that time. Los Angeles burned. We were concerned that Oakland would burn. So one of the first times as I reflect back, I wasn't thinking about that while I was doing the work. We got Korean pastors together, Alfred Smith, who is pastor of the Allen Temple, was pastor of the Allen Temple Baptist Church at that time, very prominent church, because our church was small. But I just reached out to him and Pastor Cho, who was a Presbyterian, Korean Presbyterian. We said, we got to get our people together because we're going to start fighting each other, right? Because there were also a lot of resentment and Korean shops in African-American communities kind of exploiting the people. And then, there was a killing that had happened. So there was a lot going on. And Oakland did not burn. We came together and we started listening to our stories. Find out why, that you find the Korean shops that are here. Find out why you don't find the employment opportunities and so forth, the language pieces. We had to go and start listening to our stories. As a result, Oakland didn't burn. And we started what we call the African-American Korean dialogue, right? And that was in between. And so went to the Blue House the first year, which is like the White House, our White House. Took a delegation myself. At that time, I couldn't, it was very conservative. They wouldn't let me, the Korean people wouldn't let me put in their pulpits and so forth. 10 years later, I came back and I was preaching in places where women had never been. It was this reconciliation, this kind of understanding of the importance that, number one, if we're going to attack a system, we got to understand the stories. We got to understand the culture and the history that has gotten us to this place. We cannot erase them. In her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, Dr. Joy Guri talks about that white siblings, the issue is there's a dysfunction because they won't acknowledge. They don't want to acknowledge what has happened because it makes you feel some kind of way. There was a recent law, I understand, in Texas that said, you're not going to teach race history to our kids because we don't want white kids to feel bad. This is not about feeling bad. This is accurate. You got to teach an accurate history. And then it's not about making people feel bad. It's about, because everybody has their own stuff, right? But it's about saying, this is really messing us up. This is still operating. Let's correct it. But if you don't want to correct it because you're privileged by it, then you are participating in it. And so we have to call a spade a spade. So I started doing that, that kind of dialogue. So fast forward to Greensboro. Same thing happened in 2017 when we were having our 150th anniversary, and we started researching the history, and we found out that our church had come out of First Presbyterian Church, where the pastor where there was enslavement. 4 of the 12 members were held by Pastor Paisley. They were enslaved. By the time 1865 came, there were 37 enslaved people. One slave was issued as freed. So Sid and I, the pastor at that time, had a relationship. Again, relationships, right? So we started saying, hey, this history's got to be known. So we started talking about it, and all over Greensboro, other churches started doing it. We started just talking about the history. There's a plaque that's at St. James that acknowledges it, that's the First Presbyterian is acknowledged it. So they've got all kinds of stuff they're doing if you check out their website. But the city began to say, oh, we want those kinds of relationships. So we started talking about it. So out of that conversation, understanding where we are now. What are we going to do about it? So how do we stand on issues, and how do we become the head and not the tail? So people will say, oh, that's political. Well, being a Christian means you take sides. You have to take sides. So you either take sides with Jesus or you don't. What I found in a lot of this with other white siblings, and particularly males, I have to say this, is that they would say, well, I have a purple congregation. I have all these people. I don't want to offend anybody. Really? Jesus said, blessed are they who are not offended in me. I'm going to speak this truth, and you may not like it, but I'm going to speak it because I have to open up my voice like a trumpet if things are going to change. I find so many of us don't want to do that. So I've been involved in this work, and that's what also caused me when we had Medicaid expansion. We were out there because the poorest of the poor, Greensboro at that time did not have, North Carolina did not have Medicaid expansion. I was on the board of the Cone Health Foundation and system, hospital system, very major employer at the time. So we got together the doctors who wanted to work with people who didn't have any kind of care. We worked with the county, and we started serving healthy meals, and they still have that today. And going out into the community, and those who were in situations where they were dealing with no home and what have you, we started when we opened the door to say there's a healthy meal that we looked at what the community was doing. Nobody was serving meals on Sunday. We took that day. We wanted to make sure that the whole community knew where you could get what you get, because this was a system was in place, but we wanted to do some systemic change. When we opened up the doors, we couldn't just say, y'all come to our church. We go, no, we had to go out and find out who were the leaders in their community. Just because they didn't have money, and just because they were dealing with mental illness in some cases and so forth, didn't mean that they were just going to come to your house. They don't know who you are. So we had to go out, bring ambassadors, and then we brought this community in, I understand now. And then we worked politically, white papers we did. We had people that advocating, you got to expand this. This is the reason why, unfortunately, money is such a big narrative. And I think North Carolina is there now. I left, but that kind of work, saying, people need to have healthcare. It's a human right. So we're going to do something about it. And we were able to do that because of the relationships with the hospitals system, with the county, and our involvement in the community. And that's what led to people saying, we want you to run for mayor, because we were dealing with a lot of people who were dealing with poverty. And so I was standing with them, listening to their stories. I could amplify their stories because oftentimes they didn't want to come to city council, or they didn't, for a lot of whole reasons, right? So that's how I ended up running for mayor. The faith community said, please, would you please run for mayor? Because there's a lot of money being put in downtown. There was a lot of rejection of these people over here. Yeah. You don't have a voice, you don't have money, so we don't have to listen to you. Hades, no. They had to listen to me and a whole bunch of communities. And even though I did not win that election, they did a post piece because it was huge that I had never run for office. And I gave the incumbent mayor a run for her money. And they were like, how did you do that?
Yeah.
It was a faith community that really forged that. So I've been doing this work. And it's not easy too, because people will start putting you in packages and say, oh, she's this, or she's a liberal, or she's a whatever. I didn't give a fat rat. Deliver from public opinion. Here's what I'm doing. This is where it's based upon the scripture. That's our work.
And we're grateful for that work, Diane, so much. We've got less than 5 minutes to go, and I've got 2 questions that have come in from people watching. So we're in the speed round now. I'm gonna read one of them. How about that? It's from a viewer named THA. That's Tim Hart Anderson. So he says, thank you, Diane, for showing up at Westminster. It's been good to be in ministry with you over the decades. Do you have any reflections for this Minneapolis congregation on the murder of George Floyd 1 year ago Tuesday, and the impact of what's happened in our nation and the church this year?
So the murder of George Floyd was an awakening because it was done in a place, in a space where people could finally see what actually happens and has happened to a whole host of people that can identify it. So it, to me, is an awakening. I believe that particularly Westminster being very close to the situation, but everyone at this point needs to take advantage of that awakening and to say, what are the things that we must be about? Who are we? And what are we to be about as a response to this kind of thing that we know is happening? We just saw the tip of the iceberg, right? You know, see, you know those theories where you see the tip of the iceberg, but there's a whole bunch of stuff down here. We saw the tip. So I think the question for Westminster, the question for the mission agency, the question for all of us is now, who will we be in response to this? What are we going to take on, develop, expand, so that we can see how to get to change? And it won't come overnight, it'll come over time, which means that for me personally, I'm a big person about how you understand yourself to be. If your narrative is jacked up, all the stuff that you're going to do is going to be jacked up. So what is it that you really believe, Westminster? What is it you really believe, Presbyterians? What is it that you really believe? Do you believe this gospel? If you believe this gospel, then you are delivered from your comfort. You must take up the cross and know that the joy is on the other side, and that the joy is in the work and in the journey to help other people understand what it means to be human, created in the image of God, and to live on this planet together.
Thanks. We could talk about that again for a long time. One more question, and that's, when you think about Matthew 25, that passage, the framework that sets up for this aspect of the church's work, could that draw more people to Christian faith? You know what I mean? Does that have a way of actually reducing the story of decline? I mean, how does that become appealing? I wonder if behind this question too is an appeal to other generations that aren't well represented in mainline Christianity, who are kind of already there, kind of doing this work already. Can you say more about that?
It's absolutely exciting for the next generation. Black Lives Matter was a global phenomenon. It wasn't just as a result of George Floyd. People in every cities around the world were saying, we can't have this. And a lot of the younger people were saying, I'm changing the narrative. If the church is about doing this, and of course we know the church has been complicit in so many instances with all this, they can't embrace, but they can embrace good news. If the church is about being a church that stands with those who have been marginalized because they have been othered, those who have not been treated fairly, if the church embodies this kind of justice and loving kindness and walking humbly, then you got a whole generation of people that are ready to walk with you. If we could get and stand alongside those people, those young people in those movements, and say, we are with you, this is a part of what we believe. They do a double take, really? I've seen it in Louisville when we protested. They look again because it's a different kind of witness. And there are also a lot of great Presbyterians. I talked about those who are part of this vision that are older. We are, of course, a church that's 2/3, 51 and up, right? I mean, we're an older church in terms of age, but there are a lot of us that have walked long enough and been transformed enough that we know that this is the truth of the gospel. And we can help, and this intergenerational piece, we can begin to change the tide. So there's a moment now to seize with young people who are saying, I'm spiritual, but I don't want to be a part of quote unquote organized religion. A lot of it is because organized religion has silenced the voices, have so about pouring the stuff that we believe instead of really listening empathetically and seeing God involved in the places and spaces of people who've been pressed to the margin. If we can become that kind of church, they'll run to us because it will be good news. It will be refreshing. But are we willing to die in order to do that? Because in so many instances, we have to change our understanding, our narrative, and how we show up in community. And that is key. I don't know if that's helpful, but I mean, if I had all the answers, of course, we'd be in a different place, right? But I think the issue is, are we asking the right questions? The questions are so important because the questions will lead us to the understanding of who God has called us to be. And then by the power of the Spirit, there'll be creative ways in which we act on those beliefs because it will be contextualized for Minneapolis, and for, Greensboro, and for different places around the world. It'll be contextualized. That's why I love the vision. Matthew 25 to me is so broad that everybody can get into it, but it's also fine enough for us to contextualize it. What does it mean in your particular instance? How does it speak?
Well, Diane, thank you very much. And yes, what you are saying makes sense. And we don't want you to come and give us any black and white answers. You have given us good homework, which is to study our context, follow where the Spirit is leading us, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and to keep at it. And so thank you for the encouragement you've given us. We have received our assignment. Matt, what would you say?
Just thank you for the energy you bring to the denomination's efforts, for keeping our eyes focused, but also, especially today, for bringing this word and pointing us toward hard work, but also toward hope. And I look forward to hearing the Pentecost sermon in just a few minutes.
Okay. I'm not so sure about that, but okay.
That's all right. It's a reminder, right? The Spirit leads us in this work. So. And thanks for focusing us on stories and the stories we tell, and keeping track of whose story and how we tell the stories, and to look for change there. I appreciate that a lot. That makes sense to me.
Amen. I love that this idea that Jesus spoke from his lived experience, and we need to do the same. So let's have some wider lived experiences so we really have a deep and full story. So thank you so much, Diane, and thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Alanna. Thanks, Diane.
It was a pleasure being with you. Thank you for your ministry always. That is important. Thank you.